I'm going to quickly introduce our two speakers for today. I'm very privileged because I have worked with both Miranda Pennell, who's a leading member of the Artists for Palestine UK group, for many years. They've done a huge amount of very important work promoting the idea of cultural boycott, but also just educating people across the arts world about the Israeli setup and why cultural boycott is an appropriate response to it. Jonathan Rosenhead, likewise an old comrade of mine, chair of the British Committee for the Universities of Palestine, as well as being an officer for Jewish Voice for Labour. BRICUP, as it's called, as its acronym is pronounced, is the leading organisation in this country on the question of academic boycott. And I'm sure you all know these are both quite controversial topics, but we will, by the end of the evening, know a lot more about it than most of us did before we came along. Miranda and Jonathan have collaborated and decided that Jonathan's going to kick off. Over to you then, Jonathan.
Hi, well, I'll do my best to fit into the 15 minutes I'm supposed to. Am
I
I
won't be
audible?
cruel.
Can I
Yeah,
be? Great, okay.
yeah.
There was something funny on my screen. Obviously, as you'll be aware, BDS has got three components, as you think from the initials. Um, and they correspond to different social actors who may take the action, so that the S stands for sanctions, which is a weapon that only governments can use. D is for divestment, a weapon for institutions that, because the only institutions have the kind of resources that would make a difference if they were removed from Israel. And B for boycott is a weapon for us all, or shall we say, for civil society. So that it's a way, particularly when our parliamentarians and our governments are doing basically bugger all, it's an important way that we can have a voice other than through our elected representatives. So I'm going to concentrate more on boycott than on the D and the S, but bits of that will come in. Boycott is a weapon of the individually weak who can gain strength by operating collectively as a group. Its name, as probably everybody knows, comes from the infamous Captain Boycott, who was a land agent in Ireland in the 19th century. And his tenant farmers combined to freeze him out. They just refused to give him any services because he was such a bastard, basically, and he had to leave the country. He couldn't manage the estate anymore because they would not cooperate with him. So that's where the name comes from. That was County Mayo in 1880. But of course, boycott existed well before that. If you think of the Boston Tea Party, which was a way of stopping tea with an unpopular tax being brought into the United States. That's an example. Well, I think it probably was before there was a United States. It was when it was still a colony. So that was a form of boycott. There are many famous boycotts. The ones we tend to remember are the more successful ones in the years since. So, for example, Mahatma Gandhi led the famous March to the Sea when, in the 1930s, when the British colonial government imposed a tax on salt, and he led a march to the sea where people could get their own free salt from the water, and it became one of the most famous pieces of organizing towards Indian independence. The Montgomery bus boycott in the 1950s, led by, but not only by, Martin Luther King, which was sparked by the segregation when they told Rosa Parks to move to the back of the bus and she refused to go. And there are plenty of other ones. I'm sorry. People often point to the South African boycott as the key one, which is a model for the Palestinian one. And it's important to say that for the South African success, which was the end of apartheid, boycott was only one factor. And the other factors are not evidently there in the case of Palestine. So there is a dispute among historians and people who participated at the time whether boycott was the crucial factor, or was it the internal mass struggle with trade union activity and the joining together against Afrikaans education that was being imposed on people. So there was lots of internal struggle. And in addition to that, there was the armed struggle, which played a significant role. So there was dispute about which one was the more important. Nevertheless, it's quite clear that boycott was important practically, but also ideologically, that it gave people around the world a way of uniting with the struggle of the South African people. That said, because we're seeing all this in the context of Palestine, there are many different factors in the situation of Palestine than that was confronted by South Africa. For example, in South Africa, the black population vastly exceeded that of the whites, who were the colonial masters who were trying to control them. There were very large open spaces. It's an enormous country, so the possibilities of organizing out of sight were available. And the South Africans had, by comparison with nowadays, an extremely crude technology of control, which consisted of armored vehicles and dogs and clubs and things like that. They didn't have, obviously, the computerized surveillance which the Israelis have. Those are a number of differences which makes it harder for boycott to succeed, or for the Palestinians to succeed, than it was for the opposition in South Africa. There's another difference, which I've called the Israel exception, but it's most commonly known as progressive except on Palestine. That if we consider South Africa and the boycott, just a few examples, the Musicians' Union instructed its members not to play in South Africa. Equity, the Actors' Union, instructed its members not to perform in South Africa for 20 years. And if you take the academic boycott, it was much more stringent. There was a boycott which was not always imposed, but in principle objected to any South African academic taking part in any conference anywhere. And that was employed most rigorously in the World Archaeology Conference at Southampton in 1986, supported by the predecessor of my union, the UCU. The Association of Universities Teachers was entirely behind this exclusion of South Africans. It's hard to imagine that in the context of Israel and Palestine, because of the differences in the, if you like, the ideological framework that we're forced to operate within to some extent. Also in South Africa, the sports boycott was probably the most powerful and most effective, because sports was very important to South Africa, and the international ban on South African participation in sports was, in fact, a prelude to the sanctions which were imposed by more and more countries against the country as a whole, and in the end by the United Nations. So the sports boycott in Israel, which is famous for, in terms of sports, only for the thuggery of its football supporters, is not going to have the same kind of effect as the sports boycott in South Africa. So these are things that are, on the whole, militate against just taking a straight right across that. It worked in South Africa, so it'll work in Palestine. It's probably a tougher nut to crack, but the South African one took over 30 years. So that might mean it take longer for Palestine, but we're still only 20 years into the attempt at a pro-Palestinian boycott. So there may be no simplistic read across from South Africa, but there are encouraging general lessons, which is that you don't need for the boycott to actually practically damage anything important that's going on in the country. It isn't that you stop such and such a thing from functioning. The railways don't stop running. The government doesn't stop functioning. What actually happened in South Africa was not through direct economic damage, but the country became seen as a risky place to do business. And firms that were already in South Africa started pulling out, and the only buyers of people were South Africans, so that the international financial resources that available to South Africa became much more reduced. Businesses pulled out, but also capital didn't want to invest. So in the end, it was that function as much as anything else that caused the South African government to be advised that if it didn't settle with the ANC now, it would have to do so later on much worse terms, which is why they decided they'd better negotiate. Okay, so that's the general picture. I'm not sure. How am I doing on time, Naomi? You're muted.
I was being good and staying muted. You've got 5 minutes until I was going to give you a couple of minutes warning, so speed ahead, we'll be fine.
Great. So that's the end of my general picture. I think what Miranda and I plan to do is I will talk a bit about academic boycott in particular, and she will talk about cultural boycott. So now is where I'm going to use all of my 5 minutes, or maybe a little more, to talk about academic boycott. It's interesting that the call for academic boycott and cultural boycott by an organization called PACB, the Palestinian Call for Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, preceded the general boycott call. PACB announced its call in 2004, and then the rest of Palestinian civil society thought they would join in, and the general BDS call was the following year. By 2015, the then president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, described boycott as an existential threat, and they did organize, and they set up new ministries to organize against it. But the threat that he was talking about was specifically the academic boycott, not even the cultural one. The academic boycott was the one that was an existential threat to South Africa, in a way that maybe a sports boycott, to Israel, in a way that a sports boycott was to South Africa. It's central to Israel's self-identification. It's central to its business model, you might say, and probably central to the worldwide younger generation, which is growing up with a practical argument that they ought not to be relating to Israel, and that there were bad things there. So the boycott movement was part of an education strategy that was going to change the views of people worldwide. In terms of practical work on BDS and in the academic feature world, the one that's most famous, perhaps, it's not like cultural boycott. We've got all kinds of famous people that can be boycotted, but the most famous one. I'm going to hold this up. I hope it's visible. That's the great success of Stephen Hawking, who decided not to go to a major conference in Israel. And that was a result of a collaboration between BRICUP and the Cambridge branch of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And between us, we put him in touch with Palestinian academics of a senior kind that he wanted to consult with to see whether he should agree to the boycott, and he did. So that's the most high profile one, but there's a lot of lower profile stuff which is equally important, or perhaps more important. Students, of course, in the recent outrage about what's going on in Gaza have become very active on the divestment front, because their universities have got investments in firms which are complicit with Israel. But also, sorry, I've lost my way there. There are resources there. I think the universities have investment, so it makes sense that's something that they can target. It's an institutional kind of boycott. Another main angle is that we have been very active on campaigning within the trade union for academics, the UC, University and College Union, which has for the last dozen years or so had a policy voted through at successive conferences in support of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. The General Secretary says they've got legal advice which says they can't actually do anything much. They're not allowed to spend any money on boycott. But this is being contested. And meanwhile, motions were passed at repeated annual congresses. The latest one, we got the UCU to fund a tour of 10, I think it was going to be second one, 10 or 20 universities with the Palestinian speaker arguing for BDS. So the opposition within the administration of the union is weakening as the strength of opinion among academics is increasing. And BRICUP has established a commitment to academic boycott, which something of the order of 700 academics have signed up to, and we are going to re-emphasize that in the period that's coming up. So this is a worldwide phenomenon. The American Association of University Professors, which is the equivalent of the UCU in America, has just reversed its eternal policy of being opposed to boycott, and within the last couple of months has said they're not supporting boycott, but they're no longer regarding it as inconsistent with the role of academics. So this is showing that under the awful impact of what Israel is doing in Gaza and elsewhere, the opinions are shifting, and there's quite clearly now a majority among most academics that would be at least permissive of, if not actively involved in academic boycott.
Couple more minutes, Jonathan.
Okay, I'm more or less there.
Good.
There's an interesting piece in a journal called Science Business. So it's not one of our journals, it's a technical journal. It was, I think, in May, and the headline was, "Across Europe, academic boycotts over Gaza jeopardize Israel's place in Horizon Europe." Now, Horizon Europe is the platform which gives hundreds upon hundreds of millions of pounds to academic research on condition that people get into multinational groupings and bid for the money and put up a good research proposal. And people are unwilling now to get together in units which include an Israeli component. And that is why Israel is in danger of being frozen out of this source of funding purely by the decisions of academics around Europe that they do not wish to be partnered with Palestine, or with Israeli universities. So the question which we might want to address in the discussion, this is a JVL meeting, is there a specific role for JVL, or for Jewish people more generally, but certainly for JVL, in academic boycott, or indeed in cultural boycott, or in other forms of boycott? JVL has recently, at least on its executive committee, decided that it's really important that we take boycott more seriously or more actively than we have. The question is, what makes sense for a Jewish group or a Jewish-led group in the boycott area? I'll leave that as something we might come back to.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was a whistle-stop tour through the history of academic boycott. I think one question that we're going to have to address, and I'm sure Miranda may very well take it up in her contribution anyway, is the arguments used against cultural and academic boycott. You know, build bridges, not boycotts. Boycotts are anti-Jewish. You know, it's against freedom of expression, da-di-da-di-da. So we will have to cover that point, I'm sure. I'm going to hand over now to Miranda, just for a few people who came in after the initial introduction. Miranda Pennell is speaking on behalf of, as a leading member of the Artists for Palestine UK collective, which works in the cultural sphere on questions to do with Palestine, particularly cultural boycott. Over to you, Miranda.
Thanks, Naomi, and thanks, Jonathan, for that overview you've given us. I'm going to try and give a snapshot of what's been happening in the cultural sector over the past 13 months. I'm going to talk about the cultural boycott, and I'm going to focus on some nuts and bolts about how it works in practice, some principles for strategic campaigning, which we try to follow. And I'm also going to mention holding cultural venues to account over censorship, which has been a part of our work as well. And if there's time, some thoughts on next steps for escalating the cultural boycott. I mean, I'm also like to talk about why culture is important. I mean, I'd start by saying whether as audiences or as arts workers, everyone has a stake in culture in the broadest meaning of the word, just as everyone has a stake in questions of rights, justice, and liberation. So we can talk about what this means to us in different ways. But just to give an overview, the past month has seen an unprecedented outpouring of solidarity with Palestine from arts workers specifically. Tens of thousands of artists have been mobilizing across multiple initiatives in the UK and internationally, aiming to end Israel's genocidal campaign and to bring an end to apartheid rule. So just specifically in October, at the start of the genocide, Artists for Palestine published a letter that was signed by more than 4,000 artists that called for an immediate ceasefire and issued a warning about our government's green lighting of war crimes. That same week, 800 well-known writers called for an immediate ceasefire and an arms embargo in the pages of the LRB. And within days, 8,000 visual artists called for Palestinian liberation and an immediate ceasefire and an end to institutional complicity with Israel in a letter in Art Forum magazine, which is an international magazine. And a few weeks later, a group of 7,000 musicians for Palestine, published a statement citing Artists Against Apartheid as an inspiration, the movement that helped end the regime in South Africa. And then within a few weeks, multiple new groupings of cultural workers were emerging, wanting to challenge cultural institutions that had been silent about the genocide in Gaza. Completely different reaction to Ukraine, the statements that were put out by all the British institutions, or that had tried to silence their own artists or staff, institutions doing that. And then again, cultural institutions whose sponsors are complicit with Israeli apartheid. So I'll just point to a few visible campaigns which you may well have come across. So there was bands boycott Barclays. Last summer, 100 bands pulled out of the Great Escape Music Festival in Brighton and also pulled out of festivals across the UK over Barclays sponsorship. That's quite unprecedented for Palestine. Fossil Free Books launched a campaign in which hundreds of authors pressed literary festivals to cut ties with the investment firm Baillie Gifford over investments in fossil fuels and arms. There's an ongoing campaign for Sadler's Wells to end its partnership with Barclays, led by a group called Cultural Workers Against Genocide and also joined by local PSC groups. There's the high-profile campaign to exclude Israel in the Eurovision Song Contest, led by a coalition of groups, including hundreds of LGBTQ organizations. More than 1,400 arts workers declared a boycott of the Arnolfini Arts Centre in Bristol and demanded it apologise and adopt reparative measures after it censored 2 Palestinian film and poetry events last November. The Arnolfini did just that in May, 6 months later. And then you may have noticed, or it would have been hard to miss, that just recently, a couple of weeks ago, 7,000 writers signed a declaration to refuse to publish with complicit Israeli publishers or to work with them. And that was organised by a coalition of book workers, publishing groups in the UK and in the US. So this is to say that the field of culture and all its workers is one to be reckoned with, and as such, it's seen as a key battleground by those seeking to shield the Israeli regime from criticism and accountability. And I just want to say, lest there be any doubts, we are and we must be pro-art and pro-culture and aim to both pressure and support arts organisations to be better and do better. We're not here to burn them down. The target of our campaigns are decision makers and leadership, not the workers at cultural institutions, who we always want to reach out to and take with us. But if we cannot imagine a world where festivals and theatres are not sponsored by fossil fuel, by arms corporations, by banks invested in apartheid, then we as a society have an imagination problem, not a funding problem. And I think that that's important for critics of these campaigns who think that we're anti-cultural, that we're boycotting culture in some way. So just to say a bit about what the cultural boycott is, I mean, our group, Artists for Palestine, was launched with the idea of collectivizing and mobilizing the voice of people who work in the arts to speak and act together. And that the idea would be that we'd kickstart a movement of artists who pledge to refuse to allow culture to be used to whitewash and normalize Israel's regime. So the project was intended to act as a long-term educational tool. I think that's important about the boycott. Every time we make a statement about our refusal to work with Israeli or other complicit institutions, we have the opportunity to re-articulate the realities on the ground in Palestine for audiences and readers. But basically, the cultural boycott is in the first instance a collective withdrawal of labour by cultural workers. Conversely, cultural boycott involves artists and audiences pressing UK arts venues and institutions to end all partnerships with bodies that are complicit with apartheid and with genocide. So we can say a bit more about complicity later. So we've been able to generate media interest in stories about cultural solidarity through the culture and entertainment desks of the mainstream press, where Middle East politics desks are much more closely guarded or censored. And that's been really important and it's part of our cultural movement. We've been able to use our interventions in the media to find ways of communicating with a view to reaching beyond our existing audience and supporters to mainstream the moral force of our arguments, which we think is an undeniable moral force. So we're always wanting to bring new people into our movement rather than speaking in kind of coded language only to our natural supporters on the radical left. We're really trying to really make moral arguments that anyone and everyone can get behind. So this is part of cultural work, part of creating a cultural shift, which is happening, supplementary to the boycott itself, or hand in hand. It's part of what the boycott is. Very important is that our organization was founded in response to the Palestinian call for a cultural boycott of Israel. And that's really important, that when we adopt boycott measures, we always remind our audiences that we're doing this because an oppressed people has asked us to adopt this particular tactic as a step towards ending their oppression. This is a Palestinian-led movement. The other reason it's important is that when we act together in harmony with PACB, the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, they've set very clear and detailed guidelines and strategic guides. This allows us to share a clear, consistent, ethically grounded approach to cultural campaigns in the UK and globally. So this clarity and unity of purpose, which is based on years of accumulated experience, makes our movement stronger and more effective. And that's important because we're dealing with art and artists, academics, people, they're not avocados, and it's a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to come back to some of those guiding principles. I think what's crucial about the Palestinian cultural boycott, which Jonathan also pointed out, it's never been a blanket boycott. It's never called for a boycott of individual artists. It explicitly targets complicity, not identity. And it largely focuses on institutions rather than on individuals. So this means that individual artists are never subject to boycott simply because they hold an Israeli passport, nor that they're in receipt of local arts funding at home. So the equivalent of the Arts Council funding for an artist in the UK, that of itself is not a criteria for boycott. And aside from anything, this would capture Palestinian artists who are citizens of Israel. So that's an important part of the ethics of this boycott. Cultural boycotts do become subject to boycott when a UK venue partners with the Israeli embassy or with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or with another body which can be shown to be complicit in colonization of Palestinian land, or being part of a lobby group in the UK. So that's a kind of broad kind of guidelines which we ask everyone to follow, or we're asked to follow. And just in terms of the idea of being strategic, the point of boycott and divestment is not for us to feel pure or untainted by global capital. Boycotts are not an end in themselves. They're tactics that in the first instance, they make the often hidden links to apartheid visible, and they cumulatively bring pressure to bear to end it. So our partners at PACB encourage us to, when we're considering what would be a good target, what would be a suitable target, to balance ethical principles with strategic effectiveness. So principles alone will get us nowhere if we lack a strategy for engaging with the world as we find it. And only going for impact and strategy while dropping our core principles will also fail. So a crucial point or crucial part of our work is always trying to find this balance. So we want to build power to affect policy change and not merely to score points and feel good about symbolic gestures. And specifically in arts and culture, when we think about institutional complicity, which is a huge issue that's really been revealed over the past year, we also need to remember that our aim is to grow the space we operate in. We do not want to shrink the space that we're operating. So I'll just give an example, which is our group coordinated or co-organized an event for filmmakers about exactly this, challenging institutional complicity within film and cinema. We did that at a wonderful film festival. And that film festival, which was profiling lots of Palestinian voices and films, happens to be funded by UCL. Now, we know that UCL itself has repressed its own students who are protesting the genocide, and UCL has a scheme that partners with a deeply complicit university in apartheid Israel. But it would be clearly counterproductive to be so purist as to stay away from an independently curated festival that platforms these voices during a genocide because of the policies of UCL's top brass. So I'm just trying to say that we want to avoid going down rabbit burrows or losing sight of our purpose, because these questions do come up and they're really valid. They're valid questions about levels of complicity. When in doubt, we tend to consult with partner organizations or other organizations that have the informational knowledge that will help make these decisions. Just very quickly, other principles that PACB works with and that we work with is the principle of gradualness. You know, this takes time. We're building things step by step. Context sensitivity. So what's possible in the UK may not be advisable in Germany. We adapt. We think about context in how in terms of what we do and how we do it. The other thing is potential for coalition building. Intersectional alliances are not just ethically the right thing to do, but they make us stronger. So working together and the potential for any campaign for us to work with other organizations and groups. And I guess there's something about winnability, having a sense of what winning looks like to us, whether that's a direct outcome, whether it's indirect outcomes to do with reaching new audiences, media coverage, that sort of thing.
Miranda, thank
yes.
you very much. Are you could have another half a minute.
Oh, really? Oh, I thought you were going to give me a 3-minute notice.
No. You're past that, I'm afraid, but a couple of minutes to wrap up.
Okay, what's most important? I mean, I just want to say that contrary to common beliefs about art, artists are not special, have often been on the wrong side of history and not generically endowed with special understandings of the world. Art's not intrinsically good, does not have magical power to build bridges or cross militarized borders or bring oppressor and oppressed together. But artists' voices can be important in as much as artists are sometimes in a position to publicly name things that our political and media class consistently refuse to name.
Mm.
I'm not sure. Ooh, maybe we can. And I would also say that artists are under massive pressure not to speak out. Let's be honest about that. And some of them do receive direct threats to their livelihoods. And many artists are precarious workers with insecure income. So that's all part of the picture. And I'll finish by saying there is an irreversible cultural shift in public attitudes towards the Israeli regime because of its treatment of Palestinians. And this presents a massive challenge to the other side. And that's why we're getting all these attacks on art spaces by pro-Israel groups, which tells us a lot about their desperation to just make things unspeakable. Yeah, so I'll stop there. Thanks, Naomi.
Miranda, thank you very much indeed. I think that's between them, Jonathan and Miranda, have given us plenty of food for thought. I've got a kind of question that I'll put to you myself while other people are mulling over what they want to ask. And it is really to do with the sort of history, the trajectory of the attacks that cultural and academic boycott has faced from the beginning. I mean, Miranda's already pointed out the interesting fact that it's easier to get materials sympathetic to Palestine into arts and culture areas of the media. Mary, somebody's commented on that in a message to the organisers this evening. But how much do you think that has changed? Because I can remember when the notorious campaign against anti-Semitism set itself up in 2014-15, its first target was the then Tricycle Theatre, now Kiln, which they proudly drove into, into sort of total subjugation, really threatening its funding because of the details will take too long to explain. It's all on the Artists for Palestine website. So what do you think, both of you? Can I go back to Jonathan, because you didn't really talk much about the attacks on academic boycott, and we've had to argue for the right to even think about it for many years, haven't we? Can you just give us a couple of minutes on
Yes,
that subject?
I think though it's not specifically attacks at this point on boycott, it's attacks on voices speaking for Palestine on campus, which have gone into overdrive, rather, as Miranda was explaining. I was trying to understand repeatedly how it is that these people who run our university, because it's always the senior management team that's doing this, it's coming from the top, it's not coming from there used to be resistance in the union branches. It's not there anymore, but there is resistance at the top, and I think this is a function of the universities having changed, that they are now corporate entities, and their vice chancellors meet the government ministers and they meet captains of industry because they need the funding and so on. So I actually think that there's been a change in the universities so that they are now much more compliant in trying to silence the voice of staff and particularly students at this juncture. And it's because they can see that the line on Israel is in danger of not holding. And so I do think it's, in a sense, a sign of desperation that they are willing to do such extreme things in terms of stopping perfectly legitimate expression, perfectly legitimate meetings from happening on their campuses. And I hope that the academic community, if there is such a thing, will find a way of going past these people.
Thanks, Jonathan. Miranda, do you want to comment on that aspect of the...
I mean, I agree with Jonathan, actually. Boycott is becoming, in some ways, it's less, we're not in Germany. Germany is a very different kettle of fish. And in the UK, I have to say, I haven't, the problem has been more attempts to literally cancel Palestinian either speakers or people, Palestinian cultural events. And it comes and it's from cultural institutions just wanting embarrassing things to go away and the threat of having a scandal. So, you know, a letter from UK Lawyers for Israel, a letter from the Board of Deputies, and being just really spineless. Now, on the one hand, I think we have a job of education to do. We need to speak with cultural institutions, and we need to talk to them about anti-Palestinian racism, and we are doing that. I mean, and I think we also have to make examples of cultural institutions that kowtow in such a pathetic way and do censorship. So the two examples would be Home in Manchester, which cancelled the book launch after complaints and threats that the Jewish Chronicle were going to be running a story on it. But the artists immediately, there was absolute uproar. And local artists, and it's really important, the local artists went in and literally took their pictures off the wall because there was a group show, and they reversed that decision. That doesn't mean that Home in Manchester have learnt any lessons, but it means that the embarrassment factor kind of turned around. And the other example I would give is the Arnolfini in Manchester. That was very important. They cancelled a film and poetry event saying they were too political in November. Went quiet for months, but we worked with some amazing local activists in Bristol, and it's really important. So they're local, they are there to support and to, they're there for their local artistic community, and that artistic community completely rejected what they were doing by cancelling it and declared a boycott, and it became a big campaign. Those activists were amazing. They also made very clear that they supported the workers at the Arnolfini, and but they pointed the finger at the leadership that had made these decisions. And eventually Arnolfini turned around. It took 6 months, went into a negotiation, came out and made an amazing statement that went further than any of us was expecting. They actually acknowledged the genocide and said that they understood why this was so traumatizing for their community, to not only that there is a genocide, but that they're censoring work. So, and they're taking steps, they're writing policies now. They had no policies. So that was a problem of governance at the top. That CEO or director stood down like a month later. So I think that was a very positive thing, but this is ongoing. This is an ongoing issue.
Thank you very much. I think on that note, we can definitely open this meeting to discussion. I haven't yet seen any yellow hands. Come on, people, there must be things to say. I'm scanning the screen. Oh, here we are, Pamela Blakelock. Can you unmute yourself, Pam, and give us your question? Please do keep remarks reasonably brief. After more than 2 minutes, I'll sort of start mumbling at you, because we have lots of people here who I'm sure would like to speak. Pam, and then Andrew, and somebody else whose name I can't see, but it'll come up. Thank you. Pam first.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the talks. Very helpful. So there's a couple of things in my mind. The first one is a bit tangential to this, but I want to know the details of the deal in South Africa at the end of apartheid, when I gather it was America that brokered the deal for the end of apartheid in South Africa. But it was a cost, the blackmail of the ANC or of Mandela, whereby they said, yeah, you can have the vote, but you can't change, you can't challenge capitalism, you can't have any socialist policies, which has led to a terrible situation in South Africa. They've got their vote, but their conditions are still bad. Now, that doesn't relate a lot to Palestine, because it's a different situation, but I wanted to know those details. The second point in my mind is the increased persecution of journalists now, where there's been 4, 5, or 6 really raided very dramatically, and in some cases savagely, by the police, which will have been approved of by Starmer, etc. And yeah, how we can fight back. I mean, in one way, the NUJ has the National Union of Journalists has a big responsibility. But then so does the TUC. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Pam. So that's one about sort of details of the South African situation, which Jonathan may be particularly well qualified to talk about, and also the question of, well, I suppose it's use of counter-terrorism legislation against journalists. I'm going to take Andrew Hornung and then Hilary Wise, and then maybe Jonathan and Miranda would like to come back. Andrew, do you want to unmute yourself? And Pam, could you mute yourself again, please? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I really wanted to pick up the point about the spineless university high-ups. I think it isn't just a question, the sort of question that Jonathan raised. There's very interesting material on this in Rebecca Ruth Gould's book, Erasing Palestine or Erasing Palestinians, where she talks about her experience at Bristol University, and indeed David Miller's experience at Bristol University. And one of the key things, of course, is the extremely dangerous situation of legal confrontations with organized pro-Israel lawyer organizations.
Yeah.
And I'm not defending what the universities have done, quite the contrary. I mean, I think it's appalling. On the other hand, there is a serious point that with the possibility that legal action can be taken against universities, which would ruin universities and sometimes ruin other institutions, simply in trying to defend themselves against these legal attacks. I think it's a very big problem, a problem that we really have to take quite seriously. And it goes beyond just saying, well, they're pretty spineless people. I'm sure that's quite true that they're pretty spineless people, but there's also a great danger here. And I think a great deal of work has to be done in trying to expose this kind of thing. As I say, Rebecca Ruth Gould's book, with which I don't agree entirely, but that's quite another matter, is very good on this, and I think is worth reading for this. I think I just say that personally, I find the question of institutions, not individuals, not always an easy thing. To think about. After all, the question, I think, in the case of the South African boycott, was individuals, or rather individual artists, individual groups, and so on, because it wasn't that people said, oh no, this particular performer, people, this particular people should not go to South Africa. And it was directed to some degree at individual performers and individual artists. I think the distinction is not always easy to deal with. Anyway, I just would like perhaps the speakers to be able to comment on these matters. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'm sure they've taken note of those two interesting questions. If you can take your hand down, that would be handy, and reach yourself.
Okay, sorry.
That's fine, that's fine. Next it's Hilary Wise. Hello, Hilary.
Hi.
Far away.
Hi. Good to see you. Yes, I was wondering if anybody else had been to the FOBSU, Friends of Birzeit University conference on Monday. That was really, I could only go to the morning, not sure what happened in the afternoon, but it was quite astonishing. We heard directly from academics in Gaza, and astonishingly, they are still functioning. I mean, they're managing to teach a bit online, they're having exams. You have students who are taking exams from hospital beds or on drips or whatever. I mean, absolutely astonishing. And they were really putting out a call for support, political, financial, professional. So, I mean, that's all on the level of cooperation, which I know is not really the theme this evening, but it seems to me that that is kind of completely complementary to boycott, to promote links, formal links with universities, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, which could be, institution, department, or purely personal, individual. And I think that's the kind of thing that will appeal to a lot of people who don't perhaps feel able to kind of put their job on the line almost by going for university boycott, academic boycott, but could lead to that, because there's nothing like personal contacts to really inform you about what is happening on the ground and what is needed. And also I think it's a bit harder for university, the university management to object to that, to object to cooperation. Anyway, I'd be interested to know what's happening perhaps already on those lines. I expect Jonathan knows through BRICUP what sort of connections already exist with universities.
Thanks.
That's it, really.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Do drop your hand and mute again. So there's several very interesting questions there. I just wanted to say myself about the question of individual boycotts, which Andrew raised. I think Miranda had sort of covered it. I think it's fair to say that both academic and cultural boycott would target individuals in this country intending to go and be complicit in some way or other with the Israeli regime. But what we're not doing is targeting individual Israelis for their identity. And I think that is different to the South African campaign, if I'm right. But anyway, there's plenty of questions from Miranda and Jonathan to pick up. Jonathan, you're unmuted already. So do you want to have a little go first, and then we'll bring Miranda in?
Okay. Yes, the targeting people who might otherwise accept invitations to go to South Africa in the first case and Palestine in the other case, I don't think there's any difference. It was done in both. So that, for example, when Paul Simon went to South Africa, there was absolute outrage. He made a rather good recording there, which is unfortunate, but it's very much the same as the emphasis that we now put on trying to persuade rock bands and other kinds of musicians, particularly, to go and perform there. And I think it's the difference is that there is no institutional backup to that, which there was in South Africa. Somebody like Paul Simon was doing so against the decisions of institutions, collective institutions of the cultural field, and we don't have that at the moment. The one thing that we haven't actually talked about, which I'm not sure whether it arises from the discussion, the questions, but there is such a thing as a silent boycott, and we find lots of academics. Well, not lots, but I don't know how many of them there are, but certainly academics have over the years come to me and other people in BRICUP saying, I don't know whether this is boycottable, this thing I've been invited to join in is boycottable or not, is it? And we then tell them what the guidelines say, and most often it is, but not always. Often they don't want to come out and say publicly that they're not going because of this reason. They may just decline to attend or not apply to go to that conference. Very occasionally you get people who will say, I'm not going. Sometimes they've been speakers at conferences, or people who've been awarded prizes by the Israeli government, sometimes with prize money as much as £1 million, I think it was, not dollars, who have turned them down after representations from the boycott movement, and in particular from BRICUP in this case. So that one can argue with people and ask, and they may decide that they don't want the opprobrium of breaking the boycott, even if they're not fully convinced themselves. But that's up to them. But our job is to put as persuasively as possible the reasons for them not going. And if they will also publicize that, that's great. Sorry, that's a slight detour. You're muted, Naomi.
Sorry, I'm following the rules too closely. Yeah, Hilary's point about the extent to which BRICUP and related organisations is able to provide active support to Palestinian academics, particularly in this terrible situation now, but generally as part of your activities.
The first thoughts among some academics was, these hundreds of academic staff and thousands of students were killed. presidents of at least 2 Palestinian universities were killed and were deliberately targeted, and they and their families were killed. So it was chaos. It's scholasticide. Now, this is not a moment where boycott is particularly relevant. What they actually need is help that they define with their activities. This isn't necessarily the job of boycott organizations. Often it will be people that they know in their disciplines. There are plans emanating from Israel and the United States to rebuild the Palestinian university sector in the image of capitalism and colonialism, and of course that's being resisted by Palestinian academics, and they do have an ongoing committee that's working on this. But if you've actually suffered scholasticide, an extraordinary experience, which it is even more extraordinary that, as to the best of my knowledge, no single UK university or its leadership has come out in horror and outrage at what the Israelis have done to Palestinian academia. And I think that they ought to be forever ashamed, and they ought to have their noses rubbed in it.
Absolutely. I'm going to bring Miranda in next, just to say I have seen Christina's hand. Thank you, Christina. Miranda, would you pick up some of the points raised earlier on?
Yeah, and I agree about this, the shame of these institutions having nothing to say. And I think for many people in culture, it's been shocking. Maybe we were naive before to think that certain institutions were our friends, and they really are not. Although institutions are complex and there are always good people in them. I just wanted to pick up, I was just thinking about cultural genocide, and which the UN says is describing what has happened, well, it's kind of very visibly so in Gaza in terms of the eradication of cultural heritage and the destruction of all the cultural spaces, but also thinking the kind of the denial of platforms to Palestinians and to allies of Palestinians in Britain, in Germany, in the US. And I was listening to A.L. Weissman talking about the first step of genocide is a cultural genocide where you stop people from, you can't talk about it. I mean, it is really, really horrifying, and it's very, very serious. So, and I agree, this question of spinelessness, and there is UK cultural institutions have a board structure, and boards tend to be very risk averse, and they will have people who may be not very informed on the issues that are important when they get a letter from UK Lawyers for Israel that is preposterous, but it's frightening. It's a lawyer's letter. It's threatening something, even if it's ridiculous. But I mean, when we speak to people behind the scenes, we're asking them about, we're talking about anti-Palestinian racism because, and trying to educate them. I mean, I think also it requires leadership, and I think things could change. And I'm pleased to see, I think the South Bank Centre just put on some cultural, Palestinian cultural events, the archive, the Palestinian Sound Archive, and also the Barbican put voices of what is it?
Resilience.
Resilience, obviously resistance, voices of resilience.
Yeah.
And they use the word genocide in the blurb, citing Amnesty International, and they got that past their board. And these are small steps because this is just like a one-off event, like hooray, but it's important. And I also note that UK Lawyers for Israel sent an irate email, which they made public to the Barbican, telling them to stop that event and to and they ignored it. The Barbican did not, the event went ahead. And I think that's really important. So we need leadership and Barbican has been on the defensive because it's had issues with institutional racism, and it's had problems with censoring on Palestine. And I believe they're trying to make it better, make amends. I mean, what we would need is I mean, I've also heard that many cultural leaders don't feel equipped to deal with this stuff. They're getting accusations of anti-Semitism, and they're also under massive economic pressure. All our institutions are. So yeah, that's why we have to offer support where we can, while also being critical and demanding that they don't just bow down. I think that's the main thing I was going to comment. I was also going to say, I think it's interesting that the ex-Middle East correspondent for The Guardian, Brian Whitaker, has been publishing about the compiling the activities of UK Lawyers for Israel in the cultural sphere, and publishing it on what is a fairly obscure blog, Middle Eastern blog. And it's just a real shame that journalists have to step down from their prominent positions before they speak out about these things. You know, who is going to take on UK Lawyers for Israel and expose what they're doing?
Yeah, very good question. Brian Whitaker was The Guardian's Middle East editor for about a decade, up to 2008. Very good guy. And we are kind of working with him on that. Christina, very patiently waiting. Do come in. What's your question or comment, please?
Hello, I'm sorry if this may seem a bit irrelevant, but I'm thinking of what happened with South Africa and how the people put pressure on the government to bolster the ANC in South Africa. I'm wondering, has anyone thought of coming up with a programme of actions for ordinary people to take, like writing letters to MPs, petitions to government, things that they can do that would help? What I've heard tonight has been very good, but it all seems to be at a certain level of leaders rather than ordinary people. And I think there's a huge untapped resource of power in ordinary people if they band together and if they know how to do it.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Christy. I think that is a question that's often asked, and both Miranda and Jonathan have been sort of in that discussion for quite a long time. So I'm sure they will come back to that. Thank you. I'm going to take a couple more questions before Miranda and Jonathan come back again. We're doing quite well for time here. Well, I say I'm going to take a few more questions. No hands are up. Come on, folks. Or we can always manufacture a discussion among ourselves. No doubt about that. Okay, Richard Cooper, please come in, Richard. You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, I've unmuted. Yeah, I want to kind of talk about two different kinds of things, if it's possible. One is I was very impressed by the way Miranda presented the need to be thinking strategically, because I personally feel there's a real danger that some of these campaigns become overly moralistic and people are condemned for not actively supporting this particular boycott campaign or something else from time to time. I remember with the South African boycott, two examples. I was at the time working for Pluto Press, and we were asked by an anti-apartheid publisher in South Africa if they could print books for us so that we could transfer funds to them. I made the mistake of asking someone in the ANC who said, you cannot break the law. I think this was foolish and stupid, and perhaps the real stupidity was me for having asked. We should have just supported an anti-apartheid publisher in South Africa and no one would have questioned it. The other thing is, an academic friend was invited to South Africa. This is in the 80s. Apartheid is crumbling. The whole thing is open. The universities are riddled with Marxists who are anti-apartheid. They want the international dialogue. She asked the ANC office in London if she could go, and they said, no, we have a boycott. She was an Australian academic and asked the ANC in Australia, and they said, please go. We are dying for people like you to come. Now, I'm not trying to use this as a general thing, saying boycotts are no good. Quite the contrary. I'm just using it to say they have to be flexibly and strategically thought about It's just a point I want to drop into the discussion because I know it's a difficult point, and most times I have raised this kind of issue, I'm told, but the Palestinians are demanding it. For example, you cannot even think such things, just mentioning it. But is a repeat of Jonathan's first question. JVL has decided recently we should be more active in the BDS movement, and I think we probably all in this room are happy with that. The question is, what can we as JVL do? We support the boycott of Barclays, but we do that as individual members. We can support any particular campaign, but we do that as individuals, as and when those campaigns appeal to us. Is there something that people in this webinar tonight can think of that would make sense for us as JVL to put our backs into? It would make sense to trying to get the Jewish bloc of the 9 Jewish organizations that are opposed to the genocide in Gaza to work collectively on, because I think it would be fantastically helpful if we could do this, and if we could present ourselves as a Jewish campaign for boycott of this, that, or the other. But I cannot, like Jonathan, think of what that campaign could be about. And maybe we can collectively at least work towards finding something we would like collectively to spend our energy on in this field. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Richard. As a member of JVL's executive, I too would like the 52 people on this call to help us find an answer to that question. Charlotte is very active in our education team, so I'm bringing in Charlotte Williams now, and then we'll go back to Jonathan and Miranda.
It might be, this is possibly just a question that just needs quite a simple answer, and it possibly follows on from what Richard said as well, but I haven't understood what the arguments people make that say that it's anti-Jewish a boycott campaign is anti-Jewish, other than the normal kind of conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Is there something I'm missing here? Why would we not have? Why would a lefty Jewish organization not support a boycott campaign? I don't understand.
Right, good. Oh, Richard's offering to come back in there. Jonathan,
can I just answer that briefly?
Yeah, I would say
very briefly to say the example that is used is the boycott of Jewish shops by the Nazis. That is what is always alluded to when this is made. And in response, I always make the point, the first major boycott of Nazi Germany was the Jewish boycott of Nazi Germany, called for as soon as Hitler came to power. There was a major movement in the States to boycott Germany, to boycott the Nazis, and it was broken by the Zionist movement. That's the truth about it.
Yeah, he's right about that. I mean, there are many other, I can send you some literature going back decades as to how they argue against the boycott campaign. So we've got a number of questions. One about what a Jewish organization such as JVL can specifically do to support boycott, and the other one from Christina, which is about how do people who are not themselves artists or academics get behind this campaign in some shape or form. So Jonathan went first last time. Miranda, do you want to come back in this time?
Yeah, so well, just to say, I mean, obviously I'm working in the cultural sector, and I think every sector needs to be mobilizing, whether, you know, the fire brigades, all the different, wherever we are, or whether it's about working with local council, pressure on your local council as citizens, what seems appropriate. I'd also say that in the arts, we generally, I mean, we're called Artists for Palestine, but really we're a collection of, and because there are some high profile people who are artists, they allow our message to travel, but really it's a collective of, the arts is made out of thousands and thousands, well, millions of workers at every level, from front of house in a venue to people designing typefaces. I mean, it's just a massive amount of ordinary people, and equally audiences. We're all, you know, that's what I was saying in the beginning about, I think we're all have a stake in culture. And so with the Sadler's Wells campaign, you know, if you live in that area, you might want to get involved in that campaign, so and let the Sadler's Wells know that you live locally and that you're concerned that they've got the director, is it the chair of Barclays is on their board, so very direct complicity. Equally, students, you know, students are ordinary people. Having said that, you know, PSC does the lots of campaigns. I mean, you know, the thing about being strategic is important, because if we think about complicity really broadly, we live in capitalism and everything is complicit, and we can end up boycotting every institution if you know, because none of them are doing anything. But you know, that's, you know, defeats our purpose. So that's why we, you know, it's really important to go step by step and be very focused. That's why there are lists of companies to boycott. I mean, the BDS movement and PSC will put out this information as well, so that we can all put pressure on the biggest offenders, the most directly complicit offenders. And that goes for cultural institutions as well. That's why I'm saying, if we boycott all of them, we've got no platform to speak on, and we want to speak. And also, it will only be us and our friends who are doing it. We want, you know, I think I always point to the Arnold Feeney campaign, because that was so good to work with local artists who led, but also it was also a national campaign, and that feels exactly right. You know, I think it's important. I think there's a Jewish cultural group forming, and that's important, because when we have discussions with the boards of organizations or with cultural leaders, I think that they have to be in the room, as well as our Palestinian comrades who are engaging with them. I think that will be important, but that's obviously quite niche. I think I've run out of things to say. Yeah.
That's fine. Thanks, Miranda. So you were first. So Jonathan, you still want to wait for the answer to your question, don't you, from everybody else, right? About what JVL should be doing. You don't have to answer that yourself now.
No, I got 2 or 3 points. They're not connected, so apologies. Richard argued against being moralistic on this, and he may have been thinking about some tendencies within PACB, because PACB has needed to specify, if you like, defensively, what activities it is legitimate to boycott and which it is not. So there's quite a biblical extent of rules and regulations and things, and it can get sort of a scholasticism can build in as to trying to identify under which category this can or cannot be boycotted. I think we should just ignore that. You know, it's sort of, everybody has to work it out for themselves. It's useful to know that somebody like PACB has got some rules if you want to consult them, but the general rule is that you should do stuff that you feel comfortable with, that's not going to put yourself accidentally at risk of losing your employment unless that's a moral decision you think you're willing to take, etc. So that it comes down to the individual. There are no rules, nobody's policing this, but we hope that many, many more people will do it. Couple of other things. I think on the UK Lawyers for Israel is an absolutely pernicious organization. It's along the whole slew of organizations which automatically are supporters of the settler colonial state of Palestine. And they have some senior lawyers on their board who probably ought to know better, but perhaps they know what they're doing. They send very elaborate legal-looking letters to people, which scares everyone off because it goes on and on and on, and it puts you in the position of having to spend money on your own lawyers to try and see whether there's anything in it. Generally speaking, there is nothing in it, and it's just a lot of hot air. And I think if more people just face them down and just ignore them, I think the chances of if any of those things ever getting to court are virtually zero. They just spew them out. There's a mass production process of sending out these legal letters. there's a very useful organization called ELSC, which is the European Legal Support Center. So if you feel that anyone's getting serious and you're worried, you could go to them. They have a very high record of winning all the cases that or most of the cases that they take on. Germany is the most awful country, but we come quite close behind in the number of cases they're having to handle. But it's a very, very good organization. I think just one other thing. The only thing that I've come up with, or we've come up with yet, that might almost be called boycott, which would be specific to JVL, is the trips that people make to Israel, sponsored by various organizations. The American one is Birthright. Lots of Jewish people, Jewish students taken back. If there was a way of impacting on those sorts of enterprises, trying to find ways of publicizing how pernicious they are and how they're always funded by organizations that are Israel loving, that I think that would be a possible area for JVL. It's not exactly boycott, but for a number of us to go and join in something that's happening at Sadler's Wells, adding a certain number of Jewish people to a large number of non-Jewish people who are already campaigning is not the sort of thing that will give JVL a raison d'etre, and I think and will not make a unique contribution. It seems to me we probably do have some contribution to make, but where it is not yet clear.
Thanks, Jonathan. Look, we're coming sort of towards the end of our time. I've got two new people with their hands up. That's Stephen Marks. It's lovely to see you, Stephen, and Mika Nava. So Christina, unless it's really, really pressing because you've spoken before, would you mind letting those two have their say? And then we'll probably have to wrap up with Miranda and Jonathan. But do keep in touch anyway. You can always send in comments and things. So Stephen, do unmute yourself and let's hear from you.
You hear me now?
Yes, indeed.
Good. On the CAA and UK lawyers for Israel, I share the irritation that some people have already expressed about these awful organizations. The campaign against anti-Semitism always have a stock phrase that they use about us: sham Jewish representative organization. It's interesting to know we should have a stock response which points out that, first of all, we have never claimed to be representative in the way that the Board of Deputies claim to be representative. Secondly, there is a lot of evidence about a very large number of Jews, particularly younger Jews, who agree more with us than with the CAA. And with regard to UK lawyers for Israel, of course, it's maybe, again, we should have a stock phrase that somebody who's capable of being more restrained in their language might care to devise, which points out that despite the intimidatory tone that they use in their newsletter, they have no legal status whatsoever, and that they have never actually, so far, fingers crossed, taken us to court. And maybe we should get some of our sympathetic lawyers, prominent lawyers, to agree to put their names or to help write a similar statement, so that whenever UK lawyers for Israel show their face, we can slam in our refutation. And similar with a campaign against anti-Semitism and their chutzpah in describing us as a sham and Jewish representative organization. We've never claimed, God forbid, to be representative in the sense that the Board of Deputies claim to be. And the point to make is not just that they are not, but that nobody is. And the idea that there can ever be an organization that can speak for all Jews on anything, but in particular on this, is something that should not be allowed to raise its head without being put down at once.
Thanks, Stephen. Very, very coherent contribution there. Thanks. Mika, over to you.
Yes, I think thanks very much, Jonathan and Miranda, for really good introductions. I want to address something that's had a slightly lower profile in this discussion, but Christina's raised it, about what people can do on an everyday basis, and what ordinary people, not institutions, not large organizations, what people can do. Now, this is not really a specific answer or response to the query about, or the question about what we, JVL, can do as a Jewish organization. But it is important to remember, and it was very evocative in the case of South Africa, that oranges played a big part, and that people were enfranchised on a daily basis, that all sorts of people were able to be involved, not just those with bank accounts, young people, old people, poor people, as well as large, etc., etc. And that we may, I think it's probably useful, and some people have already selected certain everyday objects in supermarkets, like Israeli hummus, and like avocados, and like dates. Three things, really. And if we can kind of add to that, that just is a sort of third way. It's not the B, oh, it's the B, not the D and the S. So I think we should keep that in mind.
Sorry, I think somebody just unmuted themselves and said something noisy. It's all right, Mika, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think people should work towards something that has that kind of high profile, and that can involve a larger number of people on an everyday basis. Because obviously the cultural issues are very important, as are the academic issues, and some people are dealing with those very regularly. Just don't want to forget the value of these iconic, ordinary items.
Okay, that's great. Thanks ever so much. That is probably all. Well, it is. Sorry, not probably. It actually is all we've got time for in terms of contributions from the participants. Thank you so much. Miranda, Jonathan, a couple of minutes each. Again, Jonathan, I think it's your turn to go first, and then Miranda can wrap up with a resounding finale.
Okay, not a lot to add. I've been very interesting to listen to the discussion and get some ideas. On the question that a couple of people have made, what is that we can do as it were, ordinary people? Not everybody's extraordinary, but I mean, not people of a particular kind. That what can we do? And there is an organization for that, and it's called PSC. PSC is the Palestine Support Organization that organizes across the country and with great effectiveness, and is the largest comparable body, certainly in Europe, and does a very good job. And its membership has grown enormously, as you'd expect, during the last year. And if you want to do work of any kind in support of Palestine, and want to find like-minded people that you can cooperate with, that's the place to go to. Now, JVL is not. JVL has got some specific remits because of it being Jewish-led, and I think we would, in my view, be misapplying our energies if, as JVL, we were to start doing those sort of things. Now, of course, I'm a member of PSC, and I boycott everything I can see. Medjool dates are always examined very carefully, and so on. So working for JVL in other ways doesn't stop you from doing all those other things in the rest of your life. I'd just like to say, responding to Stevens, it's more a question of commentary on the last question rather than a summing up. But I thought his idea of a standard JVL letter to write back to these vicious organizations that are, if you like, blackmailing people by threatening them in legalistic sounding languages. I think if we could provide something like that, it might have to be slightly different for the CAA, which doesn't claim to be so legal, but does just as bad things. People might find that very useful as a way of, first of all, the CAA would be told that they've been rumbled by lots of people sending this thing in, and secondly, people would be given the confidence to do that, and I think that would be great. I think boycott is one of the best tools we have. I think in a funny kind of way, although this is really a dark period in our lives, in a sense, what Israel is doing is trashing its own reputation for the foreseeable future. And all the things that we have been trying to organize and mobilize against what Israel does will, I think, become easier and people will gravitate to them. So I think it's a long haul, but I do think that Israel is now more vulnerable than it has been, and boycott is still one of the best methods for taking that forward. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was great. Miranda, you have almost the last word before I just say goodbye to everybody.
I mean, I just think about this thing of the idea of genocide and the idea of silencing people during a genocide being so horrific and unbelievably distressing, and I think it would be great to think of how UK LFI can be, you know, they don't win cases, they just send these letters out. That's all they do. They churn them out, and it would be great to think about what could be done to expose them. I guess that's maybe a journalism job, but maybe it's a campaign job. I don't know. I don't know what could be done. Yeah, as somebody who works in the arts, that's the area I'm in, and we've got our hands full, and it's been really devastating to understand that while there are good people who work in institutions, that institutions have not been friends to Palestine at this time. And having said that, kind of the people who work in those institutions, even the really big, massive ones, are full of staff who care, actually. And in some ways, I see our job is to put those institutions into crisis over this, and to make sure that they, you know, we have to insist that they are programming Palestinians and proper, good work, and that they're also responsible. Maybe this, I think somebody raised the question about rebuilding, really, with universities. This idea, I'm using the word rebuilding, but the idea of rebuilding through what can universities do to help people in Palestine who need to. That universities are important, and cultural links are really important, and that is something we just need to make sure that that institutions are being advised by us, by Palestinians, basically, that any gestures that are made are not tokenistic, that are meaningful. I may be running out of steam, and just to say, for us, I think the next big thing is small presses are coming out and saying they're going to abide by PACB guidelines. They're not going to be engaging with complicit Israeli institutions, which is basically every publisher and every arts organization, pretty much, with a few exceptions in Israel. So I think for us, over the next year, we'll be working to get starting with the small organizations, just small scale organizations. And I have to pay tribute to Arts Workers Scotland, who have got 150 organizations who have published a list of those who have committed to PACB. And we need to do that across the UK, and that will have an effect as well. And we know it's having an effect because in Israeli newspapers, they're writing really, really pitiful articles about how sorry they feel for themselves and how they are being seen as demons, and it's very instructive. They always include inaccuracies. I'm talking about some articles in Haaretz about how culture's being boycotted. Very inaccurate, actually, you know, full of never articulating things factually, but the self-pitying, never for a second acknowledging the reasons for it. I mean, that's not the reason why we do it. We don't, but I think it's instructive and we should keep going with it. And I can see it's 1 minute past.
Oh, yes, I'm afraid so, Miranda. Well done, though. Good time. Look, Jonathan's just let me know privately that he has one more thing he wants to say. I'm sure we're all hanging on his every word. So go ahead, Jonathan.
It's not directly relevant to the ostensible subject, but it has been touched on, which is silencing. And I don't know whether people know what's recently happened on the, you may have been listening to the BBC program called The Conflict, which has got the historian James Barr. There's been a whole series of half-hour episodes of it. Well, I think 2 days ago, Ilan Pape, having been invited to take part in that program, was disinvited on the day on which he was supposed to make the recording. So this is an example of the sort of silencing that goes on at a top-level historian who happens, unfortunately, to understand what Israel's up to, and he's therefore can't be heard. But we will be in BRICUP. I think it's a BRICUP job and also a JVL job, though he is Jewish, so I suppose JVL could do it too. But BRICUP will be taking it up as a case of academic suppression.
Great. Oh, yes, we have heard about that shameful case, and it will be fought. It will be fought. So a couple of things to wrap up with. Yes, somebody, Mary Southcott didn't get it to ask a question, but she's saying, you know, lawyers should be writing to Keir Starmer about the genocide. Yes, they should. And some have, actually. And JVL is working with people who are active on the question of UK Lawyers for Israel and also the CAA. So watch this space on both of those things. Miranda mentioned, we talked earlier about Brian Whitaker, the journalist, but he and I and a couple of very strong Palestinian lawyers are talking through ways of tackling these people. So that's a good thing. Debbie Lowther got in touch to say there's an app called No Thanks, which lists popular products to boycott. I have seen that. These things are good to look at, but sometimes it's really overwhelming because you find that you actually cannot buy any food, beauty product, fashion item without in some way supporting genocide. It becomes a bit depressing, but it does exist. And thank you, Debbie, for mentioning that. Was there anything else? Well, no, I think that's probably it. So we have been recording. We'll put an edited version of this out on the website in due course. So I want to thank everybody for their very positive contributions. And yeah, let's take it from here. Boycott, divest, and sanction away.